Hello, and welcome to Smith and Sheridan on Biotech, a podcast on the science and business of biotechnology, presented by me, Cormac Sheridan.
And me, Andy Smith. Hello, Cormac.
Hi, Andy. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks.
So, this week we are talking about gene therapy. You, in a note you sent me, you have a very provocative title, which is quite nicely phrased. The Stunted Promise and Ambition of Gene Therapies. That sounds like a bit of a tale of woe. What's your take on where we're at? Given that, obviously, there have been a whole bunch of approvals. There have been a bunch of transactions, profitable for some, not for others. Some patients are getting treated and hopefully having good outcomes. Although I must say, things tend to be a little bit opaque once these therapies get approved. It's very hard to see kind of real world data about the actual effects on patients' lives. Certain gene therapies seem to work beautifully. Others tend to be a bit more of a mixed bag. But anyway, what's your take on where the field is at right now? I mean, I guess it's a sort of a learning the lessons, kind of rolling up the sleeves and getting on with it, seems to me, is what the industry is doing.
And my perspective is slanted to a slight extent. Having worked in a pricing and market access consultancy, I did one of the original pricing and market access studies with US and European payers on one of the first CAR-T therapies. So having talked to payers, where we are in gene therapy is, moving back to the very beginning, it offered so much promise and certainly still does offer so much promise, where you can have an injection of one agent with that one therapy, that one and done or one-off therapy, cures a patient of what are some of the most intractable diseases, inherited mutations that results in shortened lifespans and disability and very expensive healthcare. So a one and done shot for those has a lot of promise. But going back on your summary, today that promise is still underwhelmed. Would you agree?
Yeah, because I think that one and done metaphor, which sort of summarizes the promise, isn't completely truthful. It's misleading. It's one and done for a while, and we're not quite sure how long. We don't know how long these vectors manage to persist within those cells that manage to be transduced by the vector. And there's two problems around efficacy and potency kind of wrapped up into that. A, how much of the target organ is actually receiving the corrective genetic cargo? Is it 10%? Is it 1%? Is it 50%? And B, for how long will it stay there? And there's huge uncertainties around the latter in particular. I mean, it's reasonably possible to measure your transduction efficiencies, I think, at this stage. But in terms of the duration of effect, we've seen with some of the hemophilia gene therapies, they start off great, and there's a very rapid decline in the effects of these therapies. 5 years is kind of what the gene therapy developers are sort of standing over. Don't think they're standing over anything other than that. I think that there was a sort of a certain simplistic way in which these extremely complicated therapies were presented to people. It was just a sort of a genetic Lego kind of a trick. And it's much, much, much more complicated to create a pharmaceutical product that does what it does safely and effectively and can be made at a reasonable cost and shipped to large numbers of patients or whatever numbers of patients are involved.
And I think we're still feeling our way, or at least the industry is still feeling its way on what safe and effective and reasonably value generating and manufactured gene therapy looks like. But you're absolutely right. And part of feeling that way relates to even the second generation gene therapies that, as you say, most drugs make their way to the liver for detoxification. Any or many gene therapy vectors will make their way to liver cells because they're seen as foreign or they're seen as drugs or something that needs to be detoxified. And then they will exert their gene insertions there. And that brings the issue, right? Because liver cells turn over. So over time, you'll see that some of these gene therapies for hemophilias A and B will decline their effectiveness over time. And that brings big issues to the sector, which it's still grappling with, and you hinted in your introduction, certainly on paying for them. So a payer's going to reimburse $2 to $3 million for a gene therapy for haemophilia A, when in 5 years the patient needs those products or needs to go back on therapy again. And that's really hard for payers to think about, right? Because payers don't get paid in one go for the lifetime of their patient. They get annual budgets. So when you're trying to recoup $2 or $3 or $4 million of a one-off gene therapy by a manufacturer, but from a payer is going to say, well, I don't get paid, for that patient's therapy. And even the existing therapies don't get paid all in one go. They get paid over the lifetime of the patient. So that issue of duration comes into play at the very earliest stages of reimbursement discussions, even before that, but even before a product gets approved. So we have still to live that down. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I would go a bit further than what you said. Companies are a bit cagey on how many patients are being dosed and what revenues are generated from that. I mean, if you look at CSL and Uniquire, they had a product approved. They mentioned CSL mentioned in its last earnings announcement that it's dosed a handful, 2, 3 of patients, but did not record any sales. And Bluebird Bio as well is incredibly cagey about what revenues they're generating from these products that were approved in the last year. So yes, lots of moving parts still to prove out.
Bluebird did, to be fair, disclose in their second quarter earnings that I think on their Gysona product for cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, that I think 5 patients had their hematopoietic stem cell and progenitor cells removed for the gene therapy step to be undertaken. And I think on the beta thalassemia side, at the same time, I think about 11 patients had started therapy. Again, I'm not sure if they'd received the actual construct, but they certainly had initiated therapy. So, but you are talking handfuls.
Yeah, and the important point you mentioned there is that patients need, in some of these therapies, not all of them, some of them need reconditioning, right? They need the same sort of procedures that would happen on a hematopoietic stem cell transplant. So they need intensive monitoring and hospitalized care. The cost of that is what I'm saying, before they even get to the price of the product. So these are the one-off doses, because as you also mentioned, a lot of the vectors will preclude repeat dosing, but their expenses are largely hidden. And as you mentioned again in your introduction, the number of patients benefiting, you would expect them to be walking among us, shouting from the rooftops, I got a gene therapy and I'm cured. And I've not seen that yet.
No, not yet. I mean, there have been some instances, obviously, where they have been very successful. But I take your point about the preconditioning regimen to knock out the existing bone marrow to enable the transduced cells to expand and grow rapidly so that you get a therapeutic benefit and they don't get kind of washed away by the existing lymphocyte repertoire in the patient. And I know companies are focusing quite an amount of effort to try to introduce milder preconditioning regimens. That would be safer and easier, because there is a very, very finite amount of infrastructure. I remember trying to get this number, and I think in a place as vast as the USA, I think it's only maybe a couple of tens of thousands of patients who can undergo this in any given year. So in a smaller country, it's going to be in the hundreds. I know that these are mostly, but not entirely, relatively rare diseases. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see where you have slightly more prevalent conditions with therapies coming through, such as, say, for example, sickle cell disease, which in the countries where it's most prevalent, there are relatively large numbers of patients. And I think in sickle cell, I think there's real promise there. It's a dreadful disease, and the existing standard of care is very, very limited. And there has been some hopeful signs that there will be progress there. But I also think, though, that the gene therapies that are coming through the approval process now will find themselves under immense competitive pressure from the gene editing therapies that are just coming up behind them. And obviously, it's going to be potentially real milestone for the biotech industry later this year, because there's a PDUFA date in December coming up for the gene editing therapy which CRISPR Therapeutics is developing with Vertex for sickle cell disease. Exocell is the sort of shorthand name for it. That has looked very promising in clinical trials. And if that kind of maintains its momentum, I think that could change an awful lot, couldn't it?
Yeah, it could to trickle down into indications that have larger patient populations rather than the ultra rare orphan diseases. Brings other issues as well. When we talked about vaccines, that they have to be very, very safe because they're given to healthy volunteers. Millions, in case of the COVID vaccines, billions of healthy volunteers. Same is true when you expand a patient population from something that's ultra rare and probably fatal and disability reigns in those sorts of indications. Then the cost benefit issue or the safety benefit issue is slightly different to when you take people that can be adequately treated, although expensively treated, fair enough, adequately treated, like sickle cell, like haemophilia B, with a larger number of patients. And let's take a step back. The whole safety issue of gene therapy was marred by generation one, that was largely done by academic centers and resulted in cancers in patients, bubble boys that died, because in those days, and to some extent even now, you try and insert a gene into a patient's genome, and if you don't get it right, or even if it's a small part of the gene or a homologous correction, it might go in the wrong place. And if it goes in the wrong place in the cell, it could cause a mutation that can cause some blood cancers or some other cancers. And that has happened. And one of the things that characterizes the safety perspective of gene therapies even today and gene editing companies is that clinical holds are de rigueur. They seem to be dropped at any opportunity, and patients have died. And I know that Bluebird, and I think it's Vertex, have talked about when they have clinical holds put on and they satisfy that with review of the data and the trial gets back on, you know that the companies say, we're satisfied that it wasn't our therapy that caused the patient to die or caused the cases. But I'm yet to hear from regulators to whether they believe that's the case as well. You know, the companies might be happy because they can conflict it, right? But the FDA, the bastion of drug safety, you don't hear it from them saying, oh yeah, we're perfectly happy, go ahead.
I thought, though, when the clinical hold was lifted on the Bluebird therapy, that the FDA said it was unlikely that the cancer arose due to an insertional issue. I do think with the therapies for blood-related disorders, there's a sort of a higher risk of some form of lymphomas or myelodysplastic syndrome to occur, because there's a sort of a rebound effect that occurs. Their bone marrows are just churning out red blood cells at a much higher rate than would be the case in a normally healthy person, because the people are anemic, and that creates inherent risks anyway, I think, as well.
And hats off to the FDA and the companies for their diplomacy, because the FDA will say it is unlikely, and the companies would say we do not believe our product is a masterclass in diplomacy from those two.
And there's a real departure between haemophilia A and haemophilia B, oddly enough.
Numbers of patients being the least issue.
But also the duration of effect. BioMarin's Roctavian, which was approved just back in June, and I know that there were blockbuster sales forecasts attached to that product, and that's approved in haemophilia A, that showed sort of a very marked decline in an effect on patients. Whereas the Unicure product, which they developed with CSL Behring in haemophilia B, seems to maintain its efficacy seems to have a greater duration of effect, and also less diversity amongst the actual patients. I think with BioMarin, some patients had a good response and others didn't, and it wasn't very clear why that was the case. So I think it's going to be a very interesting rollout. I mean, they have kind of ambitious forecasts and plans for that product, but some in the field are still a little bit dubious about how good it's going to be. And if there's some other better options that are coming along the pipeline, some patients may opt to wait if they're doing okay right now on recombinant factor VIII.
And it does illustrate where we are right now in, after 20 odd years of some sort of gene therapies or clinical gene therapies, where we are right now in almost November 2023 is still a critical time for gene therapies, because there are companies not reporting sales. We don't know how well they've done. We don't know how many are selling. We don't know how many patients are treated. We don't know how much they're getting paid for it. And we still might not know at the end of this earnings season. You can still be a bit cagey about it for a bit longer. But the archetypal so far gene therapy, Novartis's Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy, has been on the market for a number of years. And what we saw was sales grew quite nicely to what some people said are most of the worldwide sales of gene therapy products. And the last 2 quarters, Novartis have reported sales going down because they mentioned the phrase that I'm sure gene therapies will despise worldwide, is that they're now treating an incident population, which I've commented on, translates into investors thinking the product of the company you're invested in is waiting to be sold to the next patient when they are born, which is not what you expect from biopharmaceutical products. You expect to have a highly prevalent market rather than an incident market that waits for those patients identified by postnatal screening that need the gene therapy. It's a different world with very rare diseases than it is for hemophilia B, for example.
Yeah. At the same time, I mean, they're on track to achieve blockbuster sales this year, right? 928 million revenues in the first 9 months. That must be the best-selling gene therapy by far.
Oh, yeah. And apparently it does the job. That you don't hear patients coming back or patients needing other therapies. So, it's a great thing. But if you're a Novartis investor and you're thinking next year and the year after, if this year was the peak of Zolgensma sales, then you're thinking, well, what's next from gene therapy?
Yeah, and I know Novartis paid $8.7 billion to acquire the original developing company Avexis, which is a lot of cash. And that might point to the sort of overly stoked expectations around gene therapy. I mean, this was a patient population that it's pretty well known, the prevalence, and it wasn't a difficult to estimate market. So I think they paid a lot of money for it. But I guess they were buying expertise as well as that actual single program. There are other programs as well, which I think they've taken some write-offs for actually in some of their financial reporting.
But I think, Cormac, you're giving business development directors more credit than they are due. I worked for a pharmaceutical company once where the commercial people looked at an indication for a product and we said, we spent $30,000 on market research and there aren't many patients out there. And the chief exec said, I don't care, just go and do the deal, buy the company. So, sometimes people do things and you hark back to a different market, a different time, a different valuation for assets, and perhaps without the benefit we've seen of a number of 5 or so more years of gene therapies. Yeah. So would they do it again today for the same price? Almost certainly not. What the tragedy might be is that as we start to see not just the reimbursement, but the safety and duration issues that are associated, we talked about with gene therapies, as they become more obvious for ultra rare and orphan therapies, we might not get products developed for those indications and people go after bigger indications instead. That would be a tragedy.
But at the same time too, I think taking the optimistic view, over time you may not be using a viral vector anymore to deliver a genetic payload, and you may not also be trying to get a big lump of DNA into the nucleus of a cell within a target organ system. I mean, gene therapy in this kind of, no, I shouldn't use the word gene therapy, genetic medicine or molecular medicine, which can encompass the delivery of siRNA, antisense oligonucleotides, gene editing components, and mRNA. And they will be delivered typically to the cytoplasm, except DNA needs to go to the nucleus. Those delivery challenges are less. The packaging challenges are less. So that now, obviously, if you have an inherited disease, a monogenic disorder arising from a mutation, you will need to correct that mutation. But there are incredibly clever RNA editing approaches being undertaken as well, which potentially could achieve a similar outcome, except that it's done on a repeat basis in a way that, say, siRNA is dosed maybe every few months or something like that. And okay, those programs are still at an early stage, but we're seeing data in non-human primates, for example, which are pretty good model systems for humans, suggesting that these things, A, are deliverable, and B, they persist. So that all the dollars and expertise that's gone into the first wave of gene therapy product companies, it doesn't all revolve around the product revenues generated by the products that have emanated from those companies. I mean, there's other expertises in manufacturing and preclinical development, et cetera, that are really important for bringing on the next wave of therapies. And I'm calling them genetic medicines to differentiate them from classical gene therapy. I think there are real grounds for optimism. And then turning to the sort of non-viral vector piece, We all know, obviously, that lipid nanoparticles are awesome delivery vehicles for getting mRNA into the cytoplasm of certain cells. That really works for vaccines, as we have all experienced, many of us at least, I would hope. And okay, getting DNA into an LNP and getting that delivered to the nucleus is a wholly different ballgame. I know people are trying to do it, but there's other really clever little approaches that are still early stage, but you've companies like, say, Therapeutics, which raised quite a bit of cash this year, I think, to develop these protein-based nanoparticles, which are derived from endogenous proteins that are encoded in you and me and every other human being. And these are non-immunogenic, and they're little sort of capsid-like structures that spontaneously kind of form. It's kind of like a sort of a vaccine-like particle type of a setup. And there's other really ingenious ways. I've seen people using DNA itself as a nano carrier. And these are really interesting because they're cell-free manufacturing, highly tunable, early stage, but there's a kind of a vista here that's huge and broad. And never mind the efforts to engineer the AAV capsids as well for selective delivery across the blood-brain barrier and other approaches. So I think there are reasons for optimism despite the sort of, say, the bumpy commercial rollout of the first wave of products.
I agree. And I like your summary because it illustrates how far we've come, but how far we've still got to go. And to any aliens tuning into this podcast thinking, is that the best the human race can do in gene therapy? We haven't scratched the surface, as you said, on non-viral delivery yet. There are exosomes, there are non-viral LMPs that can deliver things. And we've moved beyond trying to chuck massive genes into a human that may not work or may produce the wrong things. And there's gene editing, which is a bit more sophisticated and can still use LMP delivery. So yeah, I mean, we're not halfway through yet on exhausting human ingenuity on gene therapy.
And as far as I'm aware, no alien civilization has had to put up with the expectations of Wall Street, which obviously kind of makes things trebly difficult.
Yeah, and if you are an alien tuning in and you do know the answer to delivery and gene therapy, let some biotech company know, and we'll jump ahead.
I think that's as good a note to end as any other. Until the next time, Andy. Thank you.
Cheers, Cormac. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.